we've been discussing the armor, and the second thing that we're going to be looking at is the breastplate of righteousness. So if you have your outline and you got one today, I filled in what we did last week. And so we're going to cover the outline, these 3 points that we're going to be making this week with righteousness. And that's where we'll stop, and that's where we'll end the lesson, will be the breastplate of righteousness. So if you have your old outline from last week, it's still good. If you got a new one, then you don't have to worry about last week missing those notes. If you weren't here, you have those keywords that are placed in there. But it's amazing. So, if I was to walk around like this, just to walk around with my jacket half on, you would bring it up, wouldn't you? If I just kept on like this, if I went to work like this and you're working with me, you would say, there's something not quite right about him. And if I was to get in the car and I just leave and get in my vehicle and I take off and I go into wherever I'm going to eat afterwards, say I'm going to go out and grab something to eat after worship service, and I'm walking out with a half a jacket on, you would think, there's something, does he not feel that he's got half a jacket on? There's something odd about this, something not quite right. And that is exactly what's taking place when we don't have the breastplate of righteousness on. The breastplate, for them, it covered the front and it covered the back. There was no sneak attacks because you were protected. It talks about the armor back then. It would have been able to withstand about 20 arrows, and those arrows, well, I'm sorry, not 20, but an arrow from about 20 paces is shot right at it, would have glazed it, and it wouldn't have gone in. And so there was some armor that was really protective of vital areas. And so when you look at the breastplate of righteousness, it's right living. It's living right before God, becoming more like Jesus. And so the biggest reason is, why is it even important? If I'm given something, for me, I want to know why it's important. And if I'm told to do something at work, I want to know why. Why do I need to do this? You're just adding one more thing that I've got to do. We look at schools now with all the different violence that's taking place in our society, with different things that have taken place. Now they talk about fencing. If you can have fencing 8 feet around, and if you don't have 8 feet fencing all around, then all those doors need to be locked. And we know why they need to be locked. We only have to go as far as Uvalde to know why they need to be locked. And so they have those doors shut. And then if you don't have that door shut, then there's going to be some major consequences to the person that has left it open or has keyed it down to where it can be opened. And so all those are protective measures. And sometimes it's kind of a hassle, especially if you're moving something in. You need to have a person at the door holding it open so you can get in and then closing it right away. And then you're making multiple trips backward. It's kind of a hassle, but there's a reason for it. And there's a reason for everything that the armor that God tells us as well. He tells us this is a breastplate of righteousness. It's about living right. And the reason why it's so important is because Satan desensitizes us. So that's the blank. That's the fill-in if you're taking notes. Satan desensitizes us. That's why. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 19, it says, they have become callous and given themselves up to sensuality, greedy, to practice every kind of impurity. That's what happens. You get calloused. You're not as sensitive as you were. That's what those calluses do. You guys that have calluses on your hands, that means you're able to touch some hot stuff and it doesn't affect you. Whereas a person that doesn't have those calluses, man, one touch, you're like, oh man, it's hot. And I see these people with it, basically they have a glove of calluses on their hand. And they just grab it like, it's not hot, because it desensitizes the feeling, because of all that skin that's there. The same is true with us, though. Spiritually, we can become desensitized. When we see something over and over again, a verse that we talked about last week, we'll bring up and we'll talk about now. It's a passage of verses in Romans chapter 1. It talks about in verse 18, they suppress the truth. Man, you're getting desensitized with the truth. We talked about that. They ignore God. You get desensitized. It's one of those things where I've seen parents where they raise their voice and the kid pays attention. And then and then eventually they get tuned out with that volume. So then the parent has to yell louder. And then they're tuned in again. And then all of a sudden they get used to that volume, they tune it out. Well, it seems like we can tune out God's commands thinking they're a suggestion instead of a command. We begin to ignore God. Here in chapter 1, they suppressed the truth. They ignored God in verse 19. In verse 21, it says there was no honor. They didn't honor him. They weren't grateful. They were futile in their thinking. They were foolish. Their hearts were darkened. They're coming desensitized. Satan has gone in and desensitized them. Then they dishonored their bodies. So when you desensitize, then all of a sudden, verse 24, they dishonored their bodies. They did all type of sexual things with each other they shouldn't have been doing. And then in verse 25, they exchanged God. They exchanged God for desires and a lifestyle that were not healthy and were not right. We're unrighteous. And Demas in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10, it mentions the same thing. He fell in love with the world and he left him. They were working, they were trying to do the work there with Paul, and then it says Demas left because he longed for the world. He loved the world more than the work of the Lord. And so the world gets further and further away. I mean, it doesn't get closer. The world continues to drift further away from God. And what are we doing? Are we kind of right there with them? I remember bringing up an illustration to you. If I'm just an arm's length away from the world, I'm not really in it. I'm an arm's length away from the world. And if I'm an arm's length away, you can't really say that I'm part of the world because I'm keeping my distance. But as the world gets further away from Christ, I'm drifting further away because I'm still just an arm's length away. And I'm getting further away from God. That's what happens when we become desensitized. The things that we should be doing, I got you. But as we get grown up, sometimes we think we know all the answers. And God's saying, man, I'm trying to prevent you a heartache. I'm trying to prevent you damnation. I'm trying to prevent these things so you can have a wonderful life and an eternal life in the hereafter. And the thing that we need to remember when we get confused about this world, because this world changes up the definition of right and wrong. We talked about that last week. We gave an example of Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20. But here, it's easy to remember this. Right is always right. Wrong is always wrong. Right is never wrong, and wrong is never right. And if we can remember that, we'll be making the right decisions. Right and wrong, as the world sees it, has changed. It's turned upside down. And so the world says, well, this is wrong, and the world says now this is right. And it's going back and forth, and there is this cultural war taking place in our society with that. There's a right and there's a wrong. There's always been a right and wrong. But now they're trying to flip it and say, no, these things that you thought were wrong, they're not really wrong. It's just how you feel. What's interesting, because the world says you need to live how you feel is right. They're still talking about right living, but they're making you change the definition of right living. They're saying, go and it's about how you feel about that. Well, Jeremiah 17 verse 9 says the heart is deceitful. So if you want to go on your feelings, you can be wrong. And then the world says, well, go with what you think. Live how you think is right. Well, that's another thing. Because Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5, it says, lean not on your own understanding. It says, trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding. So your understanding can be wrong. Your thinking, your feelings can be wrong. But God can never be wrong. And so if you want to be right, you follow Him, righteous. Living right, you're living with Him. And for us, we start looking at it, and once a sin in our world, once a sin is not shocking, there's a problem. And when sin is not shocking, it becomes normalized. You can see it all across the landscape. And once it's normalized, then it's accepted. And then once it's accepted, then it's practiced. It's practiced by others, practiced by us, and it's encouraged to be practiced. And you look at no further than Genesis chapter 13. You have Abraham and Adam. And Abraham says, well, choose where you want to go. And Lot Lot says, well, man, as Abraham and Lot says, well, I want this area, because in Genesis chapter 13, verse 13, he says, man, this area, in those verses above, he says, this area looks like the Garden of Eden. So he's looking at it, looks really lush and great, so he decides to go there. And then it talks about, I believe in verse 13, it mentions, now there was great wickedness in Sodom. So he was going to a place that wasn't going to be helpful for him. We don't know when he got married. The first time we hear of a wife is in Genesis chapter 19. And so there, I don't know if he found his wife there in Sodom and Gomorrah in that area or not, but all of a sudden we find his wife there. And in chapter 19 of Genesis, this area is so bad, God's just going to snuff it out. He's going to bring fire down from the sky and burn it up. And so he has 2 angels go to tell Lot and his family to get out. And they don't want to go. They would prefer not to go. And he says they forced him out. And he says, go, don't look back, just keep going. It's where your focus should be ahead, going towards safety, going towards where you're going to be rescued. It mentions that Lot's wife looks back and she turns into a pillar of salt. Now, what's interesting is, in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 8, it says, as for the righteous man lived among them, it's talking about Lot, day after day, he was tormented. He was tormenting his righteous soul over the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. But he stayed anyway. And sometimes we stay in that environment when we know that environment's not healthy for us, and we stay there and we don't say anything. And it doesn't take very long for you to look at what happens when you don't say anything. The whole society crumbles and the whole society goes by the waist. I don't know if it had changed if Lot would have said something, but it says he was tormented by this. His righteous soul, him trying to live right, he was tormented. And it doesn't indicate that his wife was tormented. It doesn't indicate that his kids, his girls were tormented. It doesn't indicate anybody but Lot. And it seems as though he might have been on his own island, involved in all the nonsense and all the wickedness and evil of his day. But it doesn't mention that he said anything about it. And it certainly shows that he stayed until he was forced to leave. For us, you've got this world. We're here in this world until God sends us home, right? So we're here. So we need to make sure we're standing up. We need to make sure that we're living righteous. There's a reason. It's important. Satan is trying to desensitize everything in this society. We see it up on rampant speed. Things double. You see different inventions, how they double, and technology doubles all the time. And it's doubling faster and faster and faster. Well, that's the same way with the wickedness in our country. With the things that are going on, we're getting desensitized quicker and quicker because society's saying certain things are okay. Now, the majority rule is the rule in our country. And it says that if you're narrow-minded and you're bigoted and you're racist and you're condemning and you're judgmental when you're in lockstep with God. That's what it says. So if you want to follow God's commandments, you're going to be ridiculed by all kinds of things. So when you're following his commands, you need to expect it. Matthew chapter 5, when he talks about these Beatitudes, the last one, it talks about bless those who are persecuted for his name's sake. We need to be willing to be able to stand with our breastplate of righteousness intact, in front and back, so there's no sneak attacks, and we're making sure we are doing what we can to do right. You see, when they throw enough at you, usually people step back. And that's exactly what Satan wants you to do. He wants to throw a whole lot at you from behind and the front and all that to where you just step back. And you go ahead and put your white flag up, saying, okay, I've learned my lesson. I'll keep living right, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to point anything out. I'm just going to put my head down and just get through it. Kind of like what the British thought when they thought Nazis were going to come in. And so they had all these banners and all these stickers made that said, keep calm and carry on. Just keep doing the British thing. We're just going to keep doing it and wait for our time. Well, I'll tell you, the time is now. The time has always been now for the Christian. When you're born into Christ, the time is now. You make a voluntary decision, but after that, it's time for you to step up. We all need to be stepping up. And we've got two choices. You either live righteous or you live unrighteous. You're either living for God or you're living against Him. And Matthew chapter 7 is a really scary 2 verses in verses 13 and 14. It says, wide is the gate and easy is the way that leads to destruction. Narrow is the gate and the way is hard that leads to life. And few there are that find it. And I have a friend in the Dallas area. Her name is Marcia, and she remembers her mom growing up. And she would talk about the different things. Everybody was doing this and everybody's doing that. And she kept talking to her daughter when she was growing up. Few there be that find it. In other words, it's going to be tough to be a Christian. You know, you're going to be called and ridiculed and saying all kinds of stuff. Even when you're just loving people, you're going to be made fun of. Even when you're loving people, they're going to say you're narrow-minded. Even when you're loving people, they're going to say, oh, they're so close-minded. You got to still be righteous anyway. We still need to show God's love when people say bad stuff. We're supposed to love all people, so hopefully we can win them over to Christ. That's the whole point. And here, in these verses, it says that gate is wide that leads to destruction, and it says it's easy to go that path. Well, sometimes we can act like water, and the water takes the path of least resistance. But hard is the narrow way. It's difficult. And there's some people that say, oh, God's grace is going to save us. That's exactly right. God's grace does save us because we can't do it by ourselves. But they assume that they don't have to do anything. There's no obedience on their part. And they say that, grace got me. I'll live the way I want to live. I've been saved, and so now I can live the heathen life I want to live. And that's not what he's saying. Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and following says you died to that sin. How can you live it any longer? Because when you were buried with him to get a new life. So you're supposed to put on him and put off the old self. So for us, we've got two choices. And one is easy. You just don't even have to make a choice. And you go into the wide gate. But going to the narrow, it's hard. That's why Joe is saying, hey, I need you to come talk to me. Because it's not easy living this Christian life. It's not easy when you're losing someone and you're discouraged and you're mourning and you're hurting. The rest of us are the same way. It's not easy. There's no way we can do this by ourselves. We've got to be encouraged by our spiritual family. Because we can't lean on each other. Who are we going to lean on? He's looking for an opening. He's looking for a weakness. He's looking a way to distract you. And then how to equip. The next point is how to equip. And it's found in the Lord. That's where it's found. It's found in the Lord. Psalm chapter 5, verse 8. It says, lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. That's how we get it. And Philippians chapter 3, verse 9, it says, and be found in him, not a righteousness of our own that comes from the law, but that which comes from faith in Christ. It's all about Christ. It's all about the Lord. We find righteousness in him. And Deuteronomy 13, or verse 10, chapter 10, verse 13 says, his law is not burdensome. It mentions the same thing in the New Testament. His laws aren't burdensome. They're helpful to us. Well, now, how do you train for it? How do you use this? We know how you gain it. It's from the Lord. So how do you train? How do you use it? Well, you follow Christ. That's the blank there. That's the point. You follow Christ. 1 John chapter 2, verse 6 says, walk in his steps. 1 John chapter 1, verse 7 says, walk in the light. So we follow Jesus. We walk in the light. It's the same thing. If we're walking in the light, that means we're following Jesus. I have a few verses I want to read. Romans chapter 6, it says in verse 12, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies, to make you obey its passions. And here's the key right here, verse 13. Do not present your members to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments of righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over it, since you are not under the law, but under grace. So he's saying, you choose to present yourself. And this today, we can choose to present ourselves. We're going to be instruments of righteousness. We have two choices, righteous or unrighteous. Are you going to be an instrument for good or an instrument for evil? That's the choice. Either righteousness or unrighteousness. As we mentioned, 1 John chapter 1, verse 7 says, walk in the light as he is in the light. And then we have fellowship one for another. And the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. That's how we can make sure that we're living right. 1 John chapter 2, verse 29 says, if you know that he is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness is born of him. So if you're righteous, that means you're just following his steps. We know that we're born of him because of Romans chapter 6, 3 and 4 says we're buried with him to have a new life. We're born into Christ. And then in 1 John, as you see, some of these have 1 John all over them. 1 John chapter 3, verse 7, it says, little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous as he is righteous. And so in other words, to do it, we need to train. We need to practice it. So how to get better? Start living right. Start following him. 1 John chapter 5, verse 3 says, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. Just like it talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 13. It mentions the Old Testament. His commandments are not burdensome. And it mentions here in the New Testament, his commandments are not burdensome. They're helpful. It helps us to become more like him. Romans chapter 8, verse 5, it says, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. So we see from these verses, there's two things we got to do to train ourselves to use righteousness. First of all, we have to practice it. And before we can practice it, we need to be thinking about it. You think about it, you focus it, and then your actions follow. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 25, the verses we looked earlier, it says they exchanged truth for a lie. We talked about last week, the belt of truth. They exchanged truth of a lie. And you think about the exchange. In Matthew chapter 16, 24 through 26, he tells his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There again, that's how we train. We follow Christ. It says, for whoever who would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? Now you think about that. What is worth your breastplate? What's worth your righteousness? What would you exchange for it? What is your righteousness worth? So think about what your focus is. Your focus tells us if your breastplate of righteousness is secured and ready to go. What has your focus been? How you spend the energy that God's given you and God's blessed you with tells you, have you exchanged the breastplate of righteousness for the energy? Because you're using this energy how you want to, and you're going to do what you want to do. Think about your money, the money that you have. I know everybody could use a little bit more. But think about the money that you have been blessed with, the finances you do have. Have you exchanged the breastplate of righteousness for the money that you have? Because you're using this money how you want to instead of glorifying God with it. You think about your talents. How have you used those? Has it promoted Christ, or have you exchanged your talents and you said, yeah, I don't need the breastplate of righteousness. I'm not going to live right. I'm going to use my talents for how I want to use my talents. I know God gave them to me, but I'm still going to use them the way I want to. Think about your time. Have you exchanged your time? While it's so valuable, you have 24 hours and that's all you have, and everybody has that much every day. If we live to the end of the day, have you exchanged that? And you said, nah, the breastplate of righteousness, that's a good piece of armor, but I'm not feeling it today. What about your life? Have you exchanged living right for how you want to live your life? And when you start looking at that exchange is a horrible exchange. That exchange rate, there's not the same value there. When you want to make a trade, you got to have the same value. I remember I told you guys about a trade that I had that a young man, a neighborhood kid, wanted to trade with me, and I got the better of the deal. Well, then there was another trade I wanted to make. And this one guy had a football card Because back in a long time ago, I collected football cards, and he had Roger Staubach. I mean, the Roger Staubach. And I had Danny White. And Danny White was playing. Roger Staubach had already retired. And so I went in and I said to my friend, I said, hey, you want to change those cards? Because your guy's done. He's not even playing anymore. And my guy's still playing. He's still, pretty good. He's there. They made the playoffs, almost made the Super Bowl. How about we do that? And he didn't want to do that. I started getting more cards to make that exchange. He never did. He kept that Roger Staubach card because that was more valuable than everything else I had. That's the way that breastplate of righteousness should be. It should be so valuable. We don't want to give it in exchange for anything. Not our money, not our talents, not our time, not our energy, anything, and certainly not our life. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 says, for your sake, he made him to be sin, talking about Christ, who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus gave his life so you could put on the breastplate of righteousness. What an exchange. He gives his life for your life. He says that's the exchange that I'm willing to make every day. Are you willing in turn to make the same exchange? Galatians chapter 2 verse 20 says, no longer I live, but Christ lives in me, because I've been crucified with Christ. Are we willing to make that exchange? My life for his. He made the exchange. It says that it comes from the righteousness of God. Romans chapter 1 verse 17 says, the righteous live by faith. And Romans chapter 10 verse 17, faith comes from hearing Christ's words. So we've got to be digging in this. We've got to be diving into it. And the one thing we need to do when the world says that we are out of our minds, we need to continue to live right. Because this is a battle that we can't lose. The war is already won. Make no mistake. But the battle for your soul rages on. And for whatever we can do with prayers, encouragement, Joe's already said how he needs to be encouraged. And we need to step up as a family and encourage him that way. Let us know what you need so we can encourage you too. Because we can't do this by ourselves. We can't do this alone. There's no way. We've got armor that he has created for us. We've talked about the belt of truth. Now we talked about the breastplate of righteousness. And we go on. It says to put on the whole armor. So we can't leave one out. We certainly can't leave this one out. If you've been having a problem living right before God, then let us know what we can do to be encouraged and hold you accountable and praying for you. And if you haven't been forgiven of all those things in the past, because you haven't put Christ on baptism to have those things washed away, as Acts chapter 22 verse 16 says, let us know what we can do. So then you can have that fresh start, as Romans 6 talks about. You get that new life. It's a do-over. It's like that video game where you have the bad start and nothing's going right. It's just a restart. You get to restart your spiritual life. But whatever your need, please come while we stand and sing.